Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome our first panel on lessons from the last recession, moderated by Heather Boushey with the Washington Center for Equitable Growth.
Please join me. Please join me in welcoming Alan Krueger and Peter Orszag. Okay, I'm going to pull this out just a little bit. I'm sure annoying all the camera people, but so I can see you a little bit better. So thank you, Larry, for an incredibly thoughtful and thought-provoking start to our conversation today. So on this panel, we wanted to start by connecting with folks who had lived through a recession before, wanted to catalog and learn about what their big lessons were this many years out from your experiences. And of course, Peter Orszag, you were with the Congressional Budget Office as the director in the run-up to during the financial crisis in 2007, 2008, and then you took the helm as director of OMB in the first couple of years of the Obama administration. And of course, Alan, you were there in the early years of the Obama administration as the Assistant Secretary for Economic Policy and Chief Economist in Treasury. And then you went from there to lead the Council of Economic Advisors. So, Peter, you had a little bit of experience both before, during, and after. And Alan, you were in the thick of it the whole time. So, so we're going to do a little Q&A. And if you have questions for them, start collecting them in your mind now. And we can hopefully learn a lot. So the first question that I had for both of you is sort of the very simple. Knowing what you know now about counter-cyclical policy, what would you like to tell yourself, let's say in 2007, 2008, 2009, what lesson, like what is the one where you're like, oh my God, I really wish I would have known that then? You've got something.
Yeah, so as is well known, every formal macroeconometric model in 2008, early 2009 was predicting a V-shaped recovery instead of the L shape that we got. And the reason that that was happening was none of these models, and it remains largely true today, have really any detail on the financial sector built into them. Yeah. So they were treating the housing bust as if it were IT bust 2.0. And after the IT bust, the initial loss of wealth was about the same in both cases. After the IT bust, the economy bounced back quickly. After the housing bust, it didn't. And the reason, of course, is that in the IT bust, the losses were spread across equity markets. In the housing bust, they were concentrated in highly leveraged financial institutions and therefore propagated and exacerbated. That would have made a very big difference in policymaking because looking back, it's often said the stimulus was too small. I think that's not really right. The problem was not how much stimulus was delivered in 2009 and 10. It was how little was delivered in 2012, 13, and so on and so forth. It was a timing question. The fiscal stimulus in 2009 through 12 was something like 4% of GDP. It was pretty big, but in part because the initial design reflected the expectation that we would be on this V-shape, there was very little attention paid to what would happen in 2012, 13, 14, 15, and that would have been very cheap to have purchased because CBO at the time was projecting that the economy would have bounced back. They would have assigned some budgetary costs to things that said, like, if the unemployment rate remains above X, these programs remain in effect, but it would have been cents on the dollar. And I still believe that was, at least personally, the biggest mistake I made, which was believing those forecasts and therefore not asking the question, should we be bolstering the automatic stabilizers in some sense as part of that initial stimulus bill?
Yeah. Alan?
A few observations. First is the economic crisis in 2008, 2009. I think was different than other post-war crises. I'm not sure how generalizable the lessons are for that reason going forward. The Recovery Act was really diverse. I mean, if you think about what the components were, and Peter has the pie chart in his mind of, tax cuts, business tax cuts, individual tax cuts, Social Security recipients, and then you've got aid to the states, you have infrastructure. unemployment insurance, COBRA extension on unemployment. You couldn't fit it on a postcard. And much of it to the public, I think, was indirect. So I think one lesson I took away is if there was a component that really was direct hiring. And Larry kept pressing us, as I remember, when the idea came up for direct hiring, how can you hire that many people that quickly? And we did have the opportunity then to keep the Census Bureau interviewers on staff. And we could have done a special census of vacant housing, something like that. Now, I'm reluctant to use the census for purposes other than doing the census. But that was one possibility. And if you go back and you say the auto bailout, which I think worked out better than anticipated at the time. I have a paper with Austin Goolsbee on this. That was something the public could certainly understand, where we were acting on behalf of preserving jobs and making sure that people were able to keep working. It also greatly helped the recovery, the fact that the supply chains were in place. And if you look at the growth in auto sales, it's driven the industrial recovery in the U.S. And I don't think that would have happened without, it would have been much, much more constrained without the bailout. And the last thing I would say, and I think Peter's observation is interesting about indexing more of the support to how the economy is doing. It was certainly the case that the fade out of the Recovery Act was a headwind, and then the sequester made it all that much worse. I would also think about indexing the aid to the states, which I think was highly effective. If you look at the loss of teacher jobs and police and first responders, it wasn't during the recession. It was when the Recovery Act money was fading out. And I think that was an effective use of stimulus money.
So a couple of questions that brings up just in terms of lessons for next time. So it sounds like both of you are arguing some variation of if you were to think about policy changes in anticipation of any potential downturn, thinking about how we index is something that we should be putting more front and center, how we calibrate that to what's happening with the unemployment rate. I mean, the unemployment insurance system, of course, does that, but then we have to have these fights each time about whether or not to extend long-term unemployment benefits. That's an issue I've worked on for a long time, and there's been a debate about whether or not to set in automatic triggers that work better. But what I'm hearing from you two is that actually we may be wanting to think about automatic triggers in a broader array of legislation. Is that a fair conclusion?
Well, the way I would put it is I do think the single best approach is to bolster the automatic stabilizers so that you don't need the discretionary congressional legislation, which even in the best of situations usually doesn't work out perfectly. And the automatic stabilizers are adjusting in real time. So what does that mean? That means, and it's basically, hopefully we'll turn to this later, but it's basically entirely the opposite direction that we appear to be heading today. Automatic stabilizers mean a more progressive tax system. That's actually an important part of the overall structure of automatic stabilizers. It does mean things like expanded Medicaid and progressive subsidies on health care so that as people shift down the income distribution, there's additional support that's given to them to help cushion the blow. It means things like unemployment insurance and the more traditional automatic stabilizers that we all talk about. But I guess the single most important thing I think we can do is to try, and again, at this point, it's probably protect against moving in the opposite direction. But if we were benevolent dictators, it would be to bolster those automatic stabilizers as opposed to trying to design the sort of perfect stimulus legislation in real time, given the complexities of doing that.
I agree with that. I would mention on UI, UI is ripe for reform. The system was built for a different era. The trust funds no longer work well.
Yeah.
But we could also think about using the tax side of UI as stimulus, automatic stabilizer, that the tax rates could adjust on employer contributions, as well as the extension of benefits.
Well, so I want to actually get to this question about what's on the table right now, but before I get to that, one other sort of follow-up question from your first comments, and also thinking a little bit about what Larry talked about in the question about trade, that sometimes So it can be really hard to be an economist because the things that we think are right aren't always so obvious to the naked eye, to the people that we're trying to explain. Is there anything in your experience about either the policy or the politics that you found sort of the ones that were just the hardest to explain? And do you have any insights now after years of kind of living through it, Alan?
Well, that's easy. I mean, the hardest was TARP.
Yep.
No president comes to office wanting to bail out failing financial institutions that were responsible for the crisis.
Yeah.
And the only reason why it was done because it would have been much worse and we wouldn't have had a recovery had it not happened. And it is very difficult, I think, to persuade the public that this is in their interest, even though in the end it didn't cost the taxpayers money and actually made a profit for taxpayers. That was the only argument that worked, was to say that this made a profit. I don't think people are thinking all that rationally when it comes to these issues. And in fact, I'm now persuaded that people choose a candidate and then they come up with the rationale why. And we focus so much on the logic and the rationale, and that might not be the way to move public opinion. But I would also say that I think that ultimately we get judged on how the economy performed. And I think that is an argument, in addition to hysteresis, which I think is a real effect when it comes to labor force participation, to use more overwhelming force up front, even at the risk of overshooting. And that's a lesson that I would certainly say was reinforced by my experiences.
Well, I guess I'd say on trade, which historically has been a flashpoint between economists and regular people. I really think, and this is not popular in the establishment at the Peterson Institute and Council on Foreign Relations, I do think that we have oversold the impact of trade agreements, and they've become the flashpoint in this debate, whereas, if you look back over the past 3 to 4 decades, international trade was driven much more by container shipping than all the cumulative effects of every single trade agreement put together. Similarly, it is interesting that many people who are adamantly opposed to the Trans-Pacific Partnership, for example, are wholeheartedly in favor of deepening ports up and down the eastern seaboard, the only reason for which is that there are now larger ships, larger TEU ships that can go through the expanded Panama Canal, and you need to deepen the ports in order to accommodate the larger ships. So trade with Asia facilitated by bigger Panama Canal and deeper ports, good. Trade with Asia facilitated by a TPP, bad. And I think that actually should be a lesson to people that there are different ways of engaging in the world that are outside of the 4 corners of a formal trade agreement that may have a different feel to them.
Yeah. Well, so let's talk for a minute about, just on the trade thing. I mean, it is so interesting because you're both trying to explain to people what's good for them as individuals and good for the economy, and sort of recognizing that there's always these multiple entry points and getting outside the box, like thinking the way real people think, which is maybe not about the specific policy that we're thinking about, but what the overall impact is. That's what I take from that piece. So let's talk for a minute about what you think. So based on your knowledge and expertise, what concerns you most about both the political and economic environment in terms of so I don't want to just say like what might lead to a recession, but what pieces of the policy agenda seem most disconcerting in terms of both preparing for and potentially fighting another downturn? I mean, Larry mentioned a few, but I'm curious to hear from both of you. Alan?
Well, Peter had a pretty good list about how we're moving in the wrong direction when it comes to automatic stabilizers with the tax system. I would add to that one reason for being fiscally responsible is that you have more headroom when the next recession hits.
Yeah.
And I've testified in vain over the last 15 years to try to fill up the unemployment insurance trust funds, which, the intention is you raise more revenue, you build up the fund, and then you have a recession and you spend it down. States that don't do that, and there are a lot that decided to use UI as a way to give employers tax cuts, are then much more stingy when it comes to unemployment insurance benefits, the duration of benefits, and the weekly benefit amount in a recession. So I worry because I think the odds of a recession, I think, don't rise the longer a recovery goes on. So sure, it's old in the tooth, but I've been saying for the last 5 years that the chance is pretty constant over the course of a recovery, and it is probably in the 20 to 30% range. So I don't think just because a candidate who was so divisive and was opposed really by the entire economics profession. I mean, one point I wanted to make, it's rather remarkable, is how not just academic economists or former members and chairs of the Council of Economic Advisors in both Republican and Democratic administrations, but you look at the National Association of Business Economists, a group that supported Republican candidates in the past. Donald Trump was their fourth choice, behind Hillary Clinton, behind Gary Johnson, and behind refusal to answer. So in some sense, there was remarkable unanimity among the economics profession, which might provide an opportunity to get some sensible advice in the next administration. So I worry about pursuing a policy of massive tax cuts at a time when deficit is above 3% of GDP, when we're facing severe demographic challenges down the road. And then you may have a recession 2, 3, 4 years down the road, and we're going to be in a much more difficult position to use stimulus. And as Larry has emphasized, monetary policy is going to be a much weaker tool at that point, too, compared to previous recessions.
Yeah.
I guess two things. One, first, broadly, and then I want to talk about healthcare for a second. But I think one of the biggest concerns we all should have is what happens when all the hype doesn't live up to reality. I was really struck by an article in the New York Times over the weekend that interviewed the employees at the Carrier plant that had been promised that their jobs would not be shifting to Mexico. And they're sort of saying, okay, make it happen. And especially since, as we were discussing before, the peso has depreciated in the meanwhile, it's yet more attractive to move to Mexico. I don't really see how that's going to, there's no plausible set of policies that are going to, quote, keep those jobs. So how does that, when people realize that, where does that go? And I think that's a sort of overarching concern that we all should have. Fundamentally, I think the political system has always tried to, promise good days ahead, but the divergence between the promises and frustrating reality for the typical American have grown larger and larger and larger over time, and they're now, it's a chasm that I don't think can be crossed. Specifically on healthcare, I wish that it were as easy as Larry made it seem to point out the arithmetic and other mistakes and what is likely to happen. I have a feeling if you read carefully the AEI and other proposals that it's going to be more subtle and therefore more dangerous, and the effects won't be entirely apparent for some period of time. I think there are sort of two basic phenomenon that may happen. One is, so just to step back, we've heard repeal and replace for a very long time. The repeal part has been fleshed out to some degree. The replace part basically hasn't. So that raises the obvious question, well, how does this play out? So there are a couple possibilities. One is that you enact the repeal today, delay the implementation for 2, 3, 4 years, and say we'll have a replace plan in effect by the time that comes along. The problem with that is it's basically repeating the Brexit play of we don't want to deal with a hard problem now, we'll push it out to the future, and it might blow up at that point. There's been plenty of time to develop replace plans. They're not easy to do, so I think that's a pretty dangerous thing, but it would mean that the problems are not apparent immediately. The second approach is to do it all at once, which apparently the president-elect has said on 60 Minutes is what's going to happen, although I'm not sure there was full understanding of the complexities involved. And for that, you'd have to look at some of these plans that are circulating out there. So there will be something that replaces the individual mandate imperfectly, probably in the form of a continuous coverage requirement. So you get access to community rating that is it does no good to say you can get insurance if you have cancer if the insurance companies can charge you $500,000 a year for that insurance. It's effectively like not having insurance. So you get the rate that everyone else gets, the premium, as long as you have maintained coverage continuously. Now, it's easy to say that, and it's going to be very hard to actually define it. But that's an example of where there will be some replacement that is probably less effective than the individual mandate to make it sort of kind of work. And so I think this is going to be, it's not going to be as glaringly obvious in terms of lack of logic as it might seem today, either because trust us, there's something coming that will make sense, or there is something that sort of kind of works, although it in practice is going to prove to be really, really not so great.
Well, and just to kind of come full circle on the healthcare, in some sense, because so many people still get their health insurance through their own employer, some of the real downsides of any repeal and replace may become more and more apparent if the economy turns south and people lose their jobs. It'll be that moment where you'll hear where some of this may bubble up to the forefront.
Well, you'll see that, but also, I mean, don't forget, the leading proposal in Paul Ryan's budget plan is to block grant Medicaid, and we've seen talk about this. So let's just pause for a moment and think about what that does during a recession, because historically, this has been a shared federal-state undertaking. That means at the margin, you go into a recession, states that have balanced budget requirements don't need to cut Medicaid as much as they otherwise would because the federal government's stepping in and making up the difference. Under a block grant, where it's just a fixed allotment, and the demands on Medicaid programs at the state level go up, but the money coming from the federal government is fixed, and you have that overarching balanced budget constraint at the state level, what happens? And I think the only way out is that you either constrain coverage or you further cut provider rates, which are already low, or do some other thing that on net means that people who would have been covered in the current structure in the middle of a recession are not. So
it sounds like if somebody were to do a policy-oriented research paper, what I'm hearing, one of the most important things somebody could do, or people could make sure that is getting out there and getting elevated and that there's debate about, is one of the things we learned was that we didn't have enough pieces that were automatically stabilizing the economy. This set of policy agendas that's on the table right now looks like it's moving in the other direction. And so we need to be thinking about this, not just in terms of that, we're going to go to block grants and some people will be cut off now, but that this actually will exacerbate and accelerate future economic downturns. So we need to think about both the short term and the long term.
You could also, in that paper, show the states are pretty effective at cutting back other programs.
They're very effective.
They're pretty effective at responding, which makes it all the more important, because otherwise education will get cut. They'll cut back on duration of unemployment benefits. They'll cut back on housing support that they provide, and so on.
Okay, yeah, so there we go. Anybody listening who wants a research project? Sounds like something to focus on. So let's go back so again, lessons learned. So because you were both thinking about the implementation issues, is there, and in the mix on those, and it was kind of a little bit, Peter, you mentioned it a little bit, one of you mentioned it a little bit already, what kinds of lessons do you take in terms of how to go out and spend a lot of money? And I mean, and to interrupt my own question, I was really struck by, I was working at the Joint Economic Committee in 2007, and if I heard it once, I heard it 1,000 times, that whatever stimulus we needed to do needed to be timely, targeted, and temporary. Timely, targeted, and temporary. Every member of Congress, they were walking around just saying that. It was like a mantra, like they're all meditating on it or something. And so we're hearing a little bit of a different answer here, but what, if the focal point was to get the money out the door quickly, what implementation lessons did you learn above and beyond the fact that we needed it to not necessarily be so quick? Is there anything else?
Well, I think that is a big one. I mean, temporary, targeted, and timely was sort of basically exactly wrong given the nature of the...
The next recession may be different.
I
exactly.
agree. Given the nature of the recession that we
Don't overlearn the
lived
lesson.
Right. that having been said, a couple things on implementation. First, there is the dog that didn't bark. I mean, we were really, really concerned about outright fraud and lots of media stories about, contractors just effectively stealing money with sham projects and this, that, and other thing. And for something that was that big, it is really remarkable that there was, I don't want to say zero, but effectively minimal to no large-scale fraud involved in implementation, which is really a testament to the Vice President's office that was kind of focused on it and all the people who were working on that, because talk about backlash to the stimulus, we were very afraid that a bunch of media stories about that would undermine support for it. So that was in the good news category. In the bad news category, I'd say, and this is why, again, I think automatic stabilizers do make sense, it's very easy at the level of a white paper or a campaign pledge to say the following things can happen quickly. It becomes really, really hard to do it in practice. And the classic example is the assertions about shovel-ready projects that when you delve down into the details turn out to be more apparent than real, that the stuff where the shovels are literally waiting for funding and we're about to go are fewer and between. And that's fine if you give it a little bit more time. So if you say, okay, it doesn't need to be 6 months, it can be 18 months, then all of a sudden a much higher share of projects actually are shovel ready under that time horizon. But if you're very focused on it's got to be really, really fast, a lot of the infrastructure stuff doesn't actually work.
I was going to add a little bit on infrastructure.
Yeah.
I don't think we do a very good job tracking when the infrastructure projects are being done. And I think that's one reason why the research is not as good as it should be on infrastructure. I think it's probably right that infrastructure spending goes out with a lag. The one exception to that is probably maintenance and repair, which has a very high return. And Ned Gramlich found that had the highest return. I never viewed this as a fatal flaw in infrastructure spending because I view infrastructure spending as both a counter-cyclical policy and a structural policy. We need more infrastructure investment in the U.S. And also infrastructure spending phases out more gradually, so you don't face the kind of sharp headwinds that we faced with the fade out of the aid to the states, for example. So those are some reflections on infrastructure spending. The housing programs were very slow to stand up.
Yeah.
And I think it is the nature of the housing markets, the fact that this was new for the federal government, for HUD and Treasury to do. I think in the long run, they actually reached a lot of people and helped a lot of people to stay in their homes. One aspect of the mortgage modifications is that they were kind of moving in the same direction that the private sector was moving. So I think it's good if you can design emergency policies like that have their wind at their back, in that they have some momentum coming from the private sector as well. Then the other thing I was going to mention, a big part of the stimulus in the last 3 recessions or 2 recessions has been temporary tax cuts, and there's now a large literature on what's the marginal propensity to consume from these tax cuts. And it looks to me like writing checks is pretty effective. I think it's more effective if you write checks to people who have a higher marginal propensity to consume, who tend to be lower income. There are political reasons why that's kind of hard to do. I think that's probably more effective than a make work pay type approach where the money goes out more gradually and people don't notice it as much.
Yeah.
So I think that's something to bear in mind if the next recession is of the garden variety type, which tends to be short-lived and then over.
So, and just to restate and clarify, what you're saying is that the research shows that giving folks a one-time stimulus check is better than increasing everybody's weekly check by a little bit so that they don't actually notice, but they spend it all.
Right. I think it's better in 2 respects. One is they notice it, which is actually helpful politically.
Yeah.
And the other is that they do spend it more.
More of it.
That's a really good thing to know. So I have a couple more questions, and then I'll open it up. I'll ask one more, and then I'll open it up. So I know that you all have been thinking about these issues mostly in your when you were a policymaker on the fiscal side. You weren't in charge of monetary policy. But can you just speak for a moment about how you thought about the intersection between what you did and what was happening in monetary policy? Do you have any sort of thoughts or reflections or advice on that side of the equation?
Well, when I was in office, there was monetary policy and fiscal policy were firing in the same direction. A lot of the programs involved using both tools. But I think I agree with the observation that when fiscal policy is constrained in a low growth environment, leaning so hard on monetary policy is third or fourth best. It's better than nothing, but it's very weak tea relative to fiscal policy. And ironically, again, it's unlikely to be well designed, but there is a certain irony in this election unshackling fiscal policy in the short run and getting some of the lift in inflationary expectations and rates that in a stultified fiscal policy environment we weren't seeing.
Yeah.
One observation is there needs to be some coordination or at least discussion between Treasury and the Fed, especially now that the Fed has a $4 trillion portfolio. The maturity structure of bonds can offset a lot of what the Fed is trying to accomplish, so it's important that they're on the same page. I think the Fed is an extremely important institution. I think the independence of the Fed has helped us historically. I think when you look at administrations that snipe with the Fed, they pay a 50, 75 basis point penalty in terms of interest rates. So I think the tradition over the last 25 years of having a mantra that the Fed is an independent organization, we don't comment on monetary policy, has served the U.S. well. And I hope we don't have an experiment testing that, but we'll see. And I think that the Fed is going to face, the problems that the Fed faces are actually good problems to have. Other central banks probably would like to be in a problem where they're thinking about, is it time to start normalizing interest rates? What do we do about our portfolio? There was more communication, I thought, between the administration and the Fed than I had realized. Mm-hmm. Before I was in the government or when I worked at the Labor Department, I hadn't realized that there was such close contact. And also, I'll say, as CEA chairman, the Fed was an extremely valuable resource if I had some questions about something going on in the economy, the effect of Hurricane Sandy on the economy, what's going on with defense spending, why is that been so slow. They have a lot of people looking at a lot of important issues, so they were always a useful resource.
Well, that's certainly good to know.
Can I, just because you had raised the research agenda, can I, before you open up, just urge one, it's slightly tangential, but I think it's hugely important for the next several years for people who are interested in policy-relevant research, which is delving much more into what is happening at the level of individual firms and how much of that is influencing the macro environment. Because we've seen a dramatic change in the dispersion of capital returns at the corporate level, the evidence suggesting that some significant share, maybe even the majority of the rise in wage inequality is between firm, not within firm, the reduction in cross-firm mobility. The dispersion between the firms that are at the global frontier where productivity growth really hasn't slowed down and the typical firms within each sector. There's all this anecdotal and partial evidence on what's happening at the level of individual companies, potentially having quite important macroeconomic consequences. And I feel like that whole field is groping, it's new and in need of a lot of bright researchers to focus on. That's my plea.
I couldn't agree with you more, and I'm going to do two things. One is that we're on February 10th, we're actually going to be doing a conference looking at wage stagnation, and that is one of the obsessions that we've been trying to think about. So we would actually love to hear from more people that want to think about these questions. But my last question, so I'm just going to sort of preview it now, but then I'm going to tell you, then open it up if people have questions. My last question was going to be, what do you think the most, Equitable Growth Fund Scholars, we have an open and competitive call for proposals out right now for people to investigate whether and how inequality affects economic growth stability, and through what channels. And so what I was going to ask you to end with is, what do you think the most important research is? What questions should we be asking, and what would you encourage people to study? While you ponder that for a moment, because I want your best answers, are there any questions from the audience? Okay, there's one over here. Gabriel, right? Yes.
I actually had a comment and a question, but then the question was about infrastructure, and you asked it already, so I'm hoping I can get away with just making a comment. And it picks up on the first question you asked in Peter's answer. So the Recovery Act was, of course, designed to be primarily a 2-year stimulus. That's when most of it was supposed to be paid out. Congress certainly could have enacted extenders. They did enact a number of extenders, so there was additional stimulus that was passed after the original act. It was less than it could have been. I think part of the reason why was exactly the problem that we had sort of thought and promised a V-shaped recovery with the Recovery Act. We didn't get it, and then people became very skeptical that the Recovery Act was actually doing anything. Now that we sit 6 or 7 years later, there's actually been a lot of academic research that's used sort of the myriad set of programs that Alan ran down, variation across states and where those programs paid money, tried to assess what did the Recovery Act actually do. I just wrote a paper trying to review that set of research. I should actually, now that I think of it, put it out through you guys.
That would be great.
But I thought I'd just say, the research is very positive. So there was some early work. I did an early paper looking at the Medicaid aid to states that found it was pretty positive. There's been 7 or 8 or 9 papers using different forms of variation. A pretty reasonable estimate from that research is a national multiplier of something like 2, GDP multiplier. That's a little bit higher than what the Obama administration assumed at the outset the act would do. So if anything, I think what we've learned since is this was actually better counter-fiscal policy than we thought it would be. But of course, that's not something we knew until we've had a chance to really dig into these details.
So can I take your comment and turn it into a question?
Please.
Okay, so one question that I was going to ask and hadn't gotten to yet is that where you started, Gabriel, on the V-shape, that many folks were, I mean, some of us were saying this is going to be, we're worried about an L, but there was this hope, and there were a lot of forecasts that said this would be a V. The American people wanted a V. I think that they are still, at least this election, I mean, I think people are still very frustrated. How do we, with you all, how do you think about connecting the dots between what we promise to people in terms of what we can deliver on, the reality of what the Recovery Act actually delivered on, and that disconnect? What's your thinking about that now?
Two comments. First, I agree with Alan. We need to make sure we're not fighting the last war, and that we're not too focused on, this recession was like this, and therefore the next one will be. That having been said, I mean, the lesson that I took away from this is if your model, and while there were people saying L-shaped, but there were no formal macroeconometric forecasting, the Fed, the CBO, all those entities were saying V-shape. And my takeaway is if your model is basically punting on the central feature of what's driving the economic phenomenon that you're trying to understand, which was the case here. So all these models were effectively punting on leverage and the financial sector and what have you. You should be very skeptical. And so that would mean that if we're in a kind of garden, vanilla type of recession in the future, and you don't need to worry about this quite as much, then you can put a little bit more weight on them. But if there's something that is clearly extra model outside of what the model is doing, you just have to dial way back those precise estimates from the model. And then that gets to your political question, which is, if you don't really know, there's always this trade-off between, I remember these discussions, there's always this trade-off of, you don't want to stand up, newly elected president, and say, this is terrible and it's going to remain terrible for the foreseeable future, basically as far as I can see, probably the next 8 years. It's not a very inspiring message. Even this is really terrible and I'm going to make it slightly better is not that inspiring a message. So it's always tempting to kind of say, we're going to fix this. The problem, of course, becomes if you don't have a plausible, if the odds of that happening are low, then you're stuck with the consequences 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 years later. I think that tension is always going to be in play. We certainly see it in play today with the incoming administration, with promises that are coming back to the carrier point very high. I think, again, when you have heightened uncertainty, the argument for a little bit more of the lowballing from a political perspective should get more weight. But it's easy for me to say this now. It's very hard to do in the moment.
Well, and it's hard when you're working so hard to say that these things are going to improve the economy. I mean, the one stat that, of course, many of us watch so closely is what's happened to median family income, which of course hasn't yet recovered from the Great Recession. Although it did great last year. Yeah. It did great, but it still isn't back to where it was. So how you both say we're doing better, but not good enough, and have that resonate. Super tough questions. Alan, do you want to comment on that before?
Well, a few things. First of all, one thing I learned is that the idea of a V recovery is rather controversial. And the idea that you kind of get back towards potential is controversial. There's been a trend slowdown in GDP growth.
Yeah.
We had a chart in the economic report of the president which just showed the growth rate over each succeeding post-war recovery, and it's been slower. The only exception was in the 80s. And there's a new paper by Jim Stock and Mark Watson which kind of does standard macroeconometrics and says what would we have predicted, and the idea of 3% growth probably was not in the cards. You know, they found 2.5% growth was the new potential. And there are lots of reasons for that. Productivity growth slowed down, which has been going on for a while now. Demographics, which were predictable. So I don't want to say ratchet down your expectations, but I think one has to recognize that if we're in an environment with slower labor force growth, we're going to have slower economic growth. And then pursuing a policy which says we're going to deport 11 million immigrants is not going to help raise labor force. So, I think if you kind of understand the problem, it leads to a different set of solutions. And that's one of the reasons why I'm concerned about growth going forward, in addition to how divisive it is in a country to attack our largest immigrant group. But I also don't want to downplay the progress that we've made. And one of the tensions I faced in 2011, 2012, 2013, as things were getting better and people were not feeling that they were good enough, and they weren't good enough, it was very difficult to say things are improving without losing all of your credibility. So I found that the communication to people just wanted to change the subject. And I very much wanted to do, Gabe, what you've done, which is to kind of go back and say, look, we got a return on these investments. And I think that's extremely important for the historical record because we will have another recession. And we don't want to be in a position where people argue you can't do stimulus to get out of the recession. So I think it's very valuable that you're doing that kind of work. And I think we also need to be kind of clear-headed. We've seen pretty strong real wage growth over the last 3-4 years. Yep. Poverty rate dropped a lot last year, probably dropped a lot 2016 as well. We'll find out a year from now or so. So it's difficult when people are hurting so much from the last recession to say we're doing better. But I think that was one area where maybe we should have found a better way of communicating, that we understand that people are digging their way out of a deep hole, but things are much brighter than they were 8 years ago. And after all, I think that's why President Obama was reelected 4 years ago. The economy wasn't as strong 4 years ago as it is now, yet he was reelected. So I think we should look at this period as one where we made tremendous progress from the giant mess that was created over the previous 8 years.
Well, one thing I take from that, and any questions, one thing I take from that is that we need to work closely, not just communicate with other economists and talk to each other about what we think is going on with the economy, but make sure that we're talking to people that talk to real people, if not doing that ourselves.
We convinced the whole economics profession.
Yeah, exactly. So one more question. Yes, right there. To the other side. Oh, you got them both ways.
Hi, so my question is regarding the stimulus. Paul Krugman frequently argues that the stimulus should have been bigger, like at least close to $1.3 trillion. President Obama's stimulus was watered down from that to about $787 billion, if my numbers are correct. Would a larger stimulus to the size that Paul Krugman has argued, would that have made much of a difference?
Well, two comments. First, again, as I said earlier, I think the problem was not how much stimulus was delivered, like in the fourth quarter of 2009. There was a huge amount of, I think it was over 5.5% of GDP, if I remember, delivered in 2009. It's rather that it ramped down too quickly relative to economic reality. So yes, that would have produced a larger 10-year number for the stimulus, but it was more about the time duration than the flow in 2009 and 2010. That's the first point. The second point is, I think the only way to have gotten that number ex post was to do what we were talking about earlier, which is to have made more things conditional or contingent on the unemployment rate. Because we did face, I know it's easy to kind of poo-poo this, but I have the scars from making the trips back and forth to the Hill repeatedly. We got the stimulus bill through by the skin of our teeth. And the thought that we were going to do 1.3 or 1.5 or 2 or whatever number in the political environment at that time, when there were more even moderate Democrats who were concerned about the price tag, I just don't think is realistic. The only way that could have happened is if we said, look, we're going to keep it well under $1 trillion according to CBO, but we just don't know how this is going to turn out, so we're going to make a bunch of stuff continue if the unemployment rate remains elevated and what have you. That would have had the result of a larger stimulus ex post, but not as scored ex ante, and maybe we could have made that work. The problem, I'll tell you, we had not a lot of discussion about this, but a small amount of discussion. And the problem is, even if CBO is saying you're going to get charged 20 cents or 10 cents on the dollar for that, if you're operating within a fixed cap that is the sort of maximum amount, that means you're taking dollars out from 2009 in order to purchase the insurance for 2013 or 14. And at the time, again, the false confidence about a V-shaped suggested that was probably not worth it. We now know that's what we should have done.
Just want to mention all the things that President Obama tried to do in that period as well.
Yes, can you please mention those?
The American Jobs Act, he wanted more aid for state governments so they could keep teachers and firefighters and police on the payroll. We did have the 2% drop in the payroll tax. He wanted much more infrastructure spending over that period. So all of that was turned down by the Congress, as well as a further extension of unemployment insurance benefits. It wasn't as if he didn't recognize that more support for the economy would have helped. I think to some extent what we've seen in this election is also kind of a reaction to the unfairness of the crisis and the unfairness of taxpayer money being put at risk to rescue the financial sector. And I asked myself, well, why wasn't that a bigger issue earlier? And I think that at a certain level, the economy is a strong enough ground that people can go back and complain about those issues. In 2009, 2010, it was like you're on an airplane that's crashing and you just want to land the plane. You don't want to call up Boeing and say, what's wrong with this engine? Who screwed this up? Then when you're on the ground, you start to ask those types of questions. And at a certain level, that's where we are now. And I think we didn't do enough preparing the groundwork for that type of a delayed reaction to the crisis.
So I'm going to end with the question that I previewed a couple minutes ago, which is, what do you think the research agenda should be, both, and I'm glad that you sort of mentioned with Gabriel, like both for posterity, for history, like what are questions that we haven't addressed yet that we really do need to nail down, but what do you think are some big things that we need to be focusing on? It's a big question, we can follow up later too, but just give me your best answers now.
Well, I've already previewed what I think in terms of being under-researched, which is this delving one layer beneath, instead of this separation between IO and micro and macro. I'm increasingly of the view that what's happening at the, quote, microeconomic level is having macroeconomic effects, and a lot more research into those phenomena, I think, would be useful.
That's great.
As having been Peter's labor economics professor, I'm really happy to hear that.
It's true.
I would highlight a few areas. I mean, we still don't understand well enough the interplay between the financial sector and the real economy. And it's entirely possible that we can have another financial crisis that leads to a real crisis. Studying financial stability and how some of the changes, for example, if there are changes to Dodd-Frank, how that could affect financial stability. Understanding changes in the housing market. One of the big parts of unfinished business is the GSEs, Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac. Mm-hmm. What happens to them? How do they affect the future financial stability of the economy? How do they affect access to housing? I've been doing work, so I'll give a plug for more work on labor force participation. The main reason why labor force participation has fallen is simply aging, but there are other factors that have taken place, and how do we raise labor force participation going forward? And then, of course, all of the work that you've done on inequality is going to be very important to continue. Inequality, I would say inequality and opportunity.
Wonderful. Well, that seems at least a somewhat positive note to leave a panel starting on lessons learned from the last Great Recession, hopefully the last one we see in our lifetimes. Please join me in giving a hand to our two panelists here.